Everybody thinks they know what runes do in League of Legends, but what if I told you that roughly 50% of players are taking the wrong rune in every single game? My name's evandabank, I'm a Challenger Mage bot laner, and in this video, I'm breaking down the 7 runes that are most typical amongst Mage champions and what rune you should be running in each circumstance. I'll start by breaking down all of the runes on a basic level, and then ultimately deep dive into what those runes actually do inside of the game, beyond just theoretical applications of them, and then ultimately we'll arrive at what champions should be building this type of rune. Let's get started. Now, to start off, I have the 6 runes we're going to go over here. And those runes are Summon Aery, Arcane Comet, Stormraider Surge, Deathfire Touch, Electrocute, Dark Harvest, and First Strike. The first thing that you will see, though, is that all of these runes have different win rates. On the screen, you'll see that Aery, all the way on the left, has a plus 0.24 win rate, meaning that taking Aery in Champ Slack gives you a 0.24% increased chance to win the game. So instead of a 50% chance, you have a 50.24% chance. I show you this not to indicate that Aery is per se stronger than Arcane Comet, because Arcane Comet's win rate is lower. There's a couple of factors that can be indicated here, but there are some things that we need to take note of because, say, Dark Harvest is for sure a weak rune. It has the lowest win rate of all of them, and First Strike is for sure a strong rune. As for all of the ones in the middle, well, there's a couple things that could be impacting it. Let's say Dark Harvest, for instance, or Electrocute, they're mostly run by assassins. Assassins could be a weaker class of character than mages, and so by having that rune built by assassins, it could indicate that assassins are weak and not necessarily the rune itself. So take these win rates with a grain of salt, though I do think that the win rates indicate something for First Strike and Dark Harvest. I don't think it necessarily says that Arcane Comet, for instance, is weak. It might just be built on champions that it otherwise shouldn't be built on, and therefore the win rate is being dragged down. So let's get started with the first rune, Summon Aery. What do we know about Arcane Comet in theory? Well, if we read Arcane Comet, it says that damaging enemy champions with basic attacks or abilities sends Aery to them, dealing damage. Empowering or protecting allies with abilities sends Aery to them, shielding them, okay? And I'm not gonna get deep dive into these numbers just yet, but I want you to notice something. If you look at Aery and Arcane Comet, you'll see that Aery, including the damage and shielding, and the damage on Arcane Comet, they both have the same scaling values. What's even more interesting is if you look at Electrocute and Dark Harvest, they also have the same scaling values, meaning that none of these runes have a difference in scaling. They only have a difference in the amount of base damage. Why does that matter? Well, it makes it really simple for us to compare how strong these runes are, because all we have to do is say, okay, Aery does 10 to 50 base damage and Comet does 15 to 100. Then we can really easy look at them and be like, wow, okay, Comet does 1.5 times more at level 1 and twice as much at max level. Wow, it seems like Comet scales really hard. So just take that as the first data point. All of the runes have the same AD and AP scaling, or at least the 4 that I mentioned there. Now, Aery as a rune, we know in theory that it synergizes with enchanting. This would make it strong with champions like Hwei, Karma, Seraphine, perhaps even Orianna, champions that have shields to utilize the shield portion of Aery. It also procs off of auto attacks, unlike a lot of the other runes here. For instance, Arcane Comet doesn't proc off of auto attacks. Electrocute, you need 3 back-to-back attacks in order to proc it, which makes it very easy to proc. You can proc it a lot more frequently than the other runes, especially Arcane Comet, and Aery returns faster than your Comet would normally come off of cooldown. But what does that actually mean? Okay, sure, we have a rune, it does less damage than Comet, but it's easier to proc and synergizes with enchanting. Well, Aery ends up being good when you can actually proc it frequently, specifically more often than you would with Comet. That's the first thing. Okay, we can proc it more often, but if we aren't procking it more often, we are doing less damage. When can we proc it more often? Those conditions include aggressive matchups where you're trading heavy, or when you're versus melee champions. It honestly tends to be that the only aggressive matchups tend to be mage versus melee champions, because it's really rare that mages will be hitting each other, like mage on mage combat will be so aggressive and they're hitting each other all the time. Now, it's obviously also a good option for enchanters and enchanter mage hybrids, being like Seraphine and Karma. It scales very well, and it's also strong early. It's strong early because it's proccable very frequently, and it scales well because it not only does damage, but it also shields your teammates. And in those long and extended fights that last 30 seconds, you might get 6 Aery procs when you only would have gotten 2, 3, or 4 Comet procs. So even though you get less value out of each proc, it's better because you can proc it more frequently. And if you're put in situations where you can actually take advantage of that shorter cooldown, it becomes very, very strong. It's also extremely generic. It's always going to grant you value, unlike something like Arcane Comet, where if you miss your spell, you get no value out of it, or Dark Harvest, where you get no value if the enemy is below half HP. Aery is the easiest to proc and the most generic. Now, I just said a bunch of stuff, but is this actually true? Well, let's take a look. We have a champion here like Karma. Karma is known for aggressively trading and also having a shield. And although a lot of people go Arcane Comet on Karma, you can see that Aery is sitting at roughly a 2% higher win rate than Comet is. Comet reduces your win rate by 1.31% and Aery increases it by roughly 70%. So this is massive, right? It indicates that Aery is doing exactly what we said, that it is best on a champion that trades aggressively, frequently, and can also shield other people. I included, for instance, 2 other champions that might generically be good with Aery. Those are Hwei and Seraphine, 2 other champions that can take advantage of both of the conditions that we talked about with Aery. Down below, I also took a look at a champion that doesn't fit the bill, Syndra. Syndra has longer cooldowns in the early game. She also pokes from very, very far away, and you'll see that Aery has a reduced win rate on Syndra, especially when compared to Arcane Comet, which is exactly what we would expect. Even though Aery does more damage on Syndra than it did on Karma, we can still see that Arcane Comet does even more than Aery, because Syndra doesn't fit the bill of what Aery is trying to do. She plays from so far away, she pokes very infrequently, and she likes to use one big combo, get in and get out. That is not what we described with Aery, and so we wouldn't really be building Aery on a champion like Syndra. And honestly, this even extends to matchups where we're Mage versus melee. There are some champions in the game that are just so anti-thematic to the rune that they shouldn't be building it regardless. A champion that might fall in the middle of Karma and Syndra would be Victor. Victor does poke pretty frequently. He can get into some extended fights. He has high movement speed, letting him stay in combat for longer and dodge spells. And generally speaking, he might be able to take better advantage of Summon Aery rather than Arcane Comet. So I say that just to give you guys an example of the types of champions that might be good with this rune. Now let's move on to Arcane Comet. What do we know about Arcane Comet? Well, Arcane Comet synergizes with long-range champions. It says that if you damage a champion with an ability, it hurls a comet, dealing increased damage based on the distance. And this is the change that they introduced a couple of months ago. The adaptive damage is 15 to 100, and then it has the same scaling as Aery, but it introduces a cooldown, 20 to 8 seconds, scaling down based on level, and the damage amplification that it does based on distance traveled is double damage at 750 range. So it's obvious that it's good with longer range champions that can proc it from far away. We also see that it doesn't proc off of auto attacks, so we need to actually be able to hit them with spells. It has a long cooldown relative to Aery and something like Deathfire Touch, which doesn't have a cooldown, and it's incredibly simple. You just hit them with the spell and you take advantage of what the rune sets out to do. There's no complicated pattern to apply it. Very easy. What does this mean? Well, you need to be a long range champion. Otherwise, you're missing out on half of the value of the rune. If you're not a long range champion, the damage is almost equal to Aery, and when factoring in how often you proc it, it's just worse. With that said, Comet does do more scaling damage than Aery and other runes. It's designed to be weaker early, though not useless like some of these runes. For instance, Dark Harvest, we'll get into in a moment, is just incredibly weak early because, hey, it's useless inside of trades unless the enemy is below half HP. Comet also tends to be stronger for burst champions and champions that do damage less frequently, since it has a longer cooldown and does a lot of damage. So if you just hit them once and back up and take advantage of the Comet, you aren't missing out on any value that you would have gotten by having another rune with a shorter cooldown. With that said, the last point here being that it's stronger for champions that are pure mages. It doesn't have any feature about enchanting, it doesn't have any feature about damage over time, about being a battle mage, etc. It is stronger for champions like Orianna, Syndra, Hwei, than a wide breadth of other champions. Pure mages is what we're looking for here. So I have a list of champions here that would be really, really good with Comet inherently. Xerath, Syndra, Orianna, Hwei, Vel'Koz, and almost every other traditional mage do fit this bill. With that said, even though they fit the bill of running Arcane Comet, it doesn't mean that Comet is their only rune. Xerath, for example, is really good with First Strike, and so in some games, when we get to First Strike later, you might fit the conditions of running First Strike better than you meet the conditions of running Arcane Comet. This also doesn't include non-traditional mages, so think Aurora, Vladimir, Vex, Ryze, champions that are more battle mages that play in your face, maybe even Cassiopeia. They don't fit the bill of Arcane Comet because they don't play from long range and they don't weave in spells in quite the fashion that we're looking for here. They would take better advantage of some of the other runes. Third, we have Stormraider Surge. Stormraider Surge activates after you do 25% of a champion's max health within 3 seconds. It gives you bonus move speed and slow resistance for 4 seconds. It's also 75% effective on ranged champions. So what do we know? Well, it's obvious that it has a 25% maximum HP requirement. This is hard to accomplish in the early game. It's also weaker for ranged champions because it does only 75% effectiveness. It does 0 damage. So if you full trade an enemy and you both all hit your spells, you will do less damage if you have Stormraider Surge because your rune didn't do any damage, and it also didn't enable you to dodge any damage unless you use that movement speed to get out of the way of an enemy spell. It also synergizes with champions that care about movement speed because Hey, it's giving me movement speed. But if I play from off your screen, what do I care if I have more movement speed? You can't hit me anyways. It's terrible on long-range mages for that reason. Champions that play from off your screen don't care about how fast they are. Xerath is not dying anyways. If he has 500 or 300 movement speed, it doesn't matter all too much in the late game. He's gonna ult you from off your screen, and that's his play pattern. It scales incredibly well because damage from runes becomes less important later on in the game as base damage from spells and items becomes increasingly more effective, doing roughly 95% of your damage, where runes are just like the remaining 5% and arguably don't matter since everyone is getting overkilled anyways. Keep that in mind. Utility from a rune, such as this one, scales incredibly well, whereas damage scales, relatively speaking, a little bit worse. It's also bad for champions with thresholds. These are champions that must kill you in one combo, such as Jhin. Why does Jhin need to kill you in one combo? Well, he has 4 bullets, 1 W, and 1 Q. And if he doesn't kill you in that combo, he has to reload. There's a lot of champions like this that have really long cooldowns. Think LeBlanc. If LeBlanc doesn't kill you with all of her spells, you're just living. She's not waiting until she gets another Q, E, or W. It's too dangerous, and they're too long of cooldowns. So these champions need to maximize damage, ensuring they can kill people in one combo. And if your champion is a threshold champion, high burst and low CDR, then you should not be running this rune. I have an example here just to prove that this rune is not good on the champions that I proclaimed. Orianna, which is one of our traditional mages that we mentioned earlier, is really bad with Stormraider Surge. When Orianna runs Stormraider Surge, she loses 0.72% win rate on average just in champ select. Champions that it would be good on though are mostly battle mages, such as Ryze, maybe Vladimir or Cassiopeia, but almost nobody else wants this. It's for champions that are short range and want to dodge around in close quarters. It's not really a mage rune anymore because the 25% threshold kills the rune on champions that otherwise could just proc it from really far away and run around to land more spells. It doesn't accomplish that goal anymore, and so it's lost its place as one of our mage runes, except for those select few battle mages. Next we have Deathfire Touch, the newest addition to mage runes, but also the least understood and most complicated. The first thing I want to note is that Deathfire Touch's win rate has been going down because Riot has been nerfing it. You will see that the win rate on Deathfire Touch adds 0.24, so it is better than a 50% win rate rune, but I'm going to argue that Deathfire Touch is the single most overutilized rune and should only be built on a select few champions. First, Deathfire Touch has no cooldown. It synergizes with burn effects. Champions that want to do damage over time do really good with this rune. Think Brand or Malzahar. Does magic damage. All other runes do adaptive damage. Who cares? I do. Why do I care? Because if you're Smolder and you have this rune and you do physical and magic damage and the enemy builds armor, at least some of your damage is still effective at killing that enemy tank. So it's really good to have mixed damage types, and this makes Deathfire Touch a lot better on AD champions than it otherwise would be if it just did adaptive damage and gave them more AD instead of magic damage. So just note that like splitting your damage type is really important. It doesn't mean that it's bad on mages that do magic damage, but it means it's also really good on otherwise physical dealing characters. The damage increases if the enemy has been burning for 3 seconds, so this is good. You want to chain together your burns, and the duration changes depending on the type of spell. This shit is super important. Make sure you understand that. So it says the duration here, single target lasts 4 seconds, area of effect lasts 2 seconds, and damage over time lasts 1 second. So actually only 2 of Hwei's spells are single target spells. Can you guess what they are? Those are his EQ, his Fear, and his EW, which is his Root. All of his other spells are area of effect spells, only proccing Deathfire Touch for 2 seconds. So you can imagine in lane proccing Deathfire Touch and doing 5 magic damage per second for 2 seconds, giving him 10 damage, or proccing Arcane Comet doing 20 damage with the potential to do 40 if the enemy is far enough away. This rune does half as much damage on an AoE spell as a single target spell, because not only does a single target spell last twice as long, it also gets the 75% damage increase because they've been burning for longer than 3 seconds. So just take note of the duration change depending on the type of ability. It's not the end all be all. A champion like Brand, who only really has damage over time spells, really appreciates Deathfire Touch, even though he only procs it for 1 second with his passive. So it can be strong on those outlying champions, but it is really important to note that for most traditional mages, they don't like this rune because they don't proc it with single target spells. Now, as I said, this rune is terrible on champions that have improper spell types. If you have no single target spells, it's likely that this rune is really bad. It's generally a weak rune. It has pretty low damage and win rate, and it's only good on, say, say 10 to 15 champions in the game. It's amazing on those select few champions though that can proc it for those extended period of time, but if you can't, it's really bad, and those champions will get the twice as much damage value from the rune for them burning for more than that 3 seconds. It's not a generic keystone, it's very good on some champions, and it's terrible on others. Now, I don't have some champions picked out that are good with this rune, but I would say the champions that are good with this rune should be pretty obvious. If you're a champion that stays in combat for a really long period of time, that has burn effects or otherwise single target effects that will make Deathfire Touch last for more than 3 seconds, think Rise, Cassiopeia, Brand, Zyra, any of those champions, they'll be really strong with the rune. Those champions were traditionally either battle mages or champions that built Arcane Comet. If that's what your champion did a couple of seasons ago, then you're going to look to Deathfire Touch as your new rune. Next, we have Electrocute. Electrocute procs off of 3 separate attacks or abilities within 3 seconds, dealing bonus adaptive damage, so we're back to adaptive damage runes, and it does 70 to 240 damage with a 20-second cooldown. Note that Aery, which we talked about previously, was 10 to 50 damage with the same scaling, so the base damage on Aery is significantly less than the base damage on Electrocute. Electrocute has a high cooldown relative to the other runes, and it doesn't decrease depending on game length or your level. It's the longest cooldown outside of Dark Harvest, though technically because Dark Harvest resets on kill. It is really high damage though, it has the highest base damage, and it has the same exact damage scaling as Arcane Comet. It is a higher condition to apply it though. You need 3 separate attacks and abilities, unlike Arcane Comet where you just needed 1 ability, and Summon Aery where you just needed an attack or an ability. Either or would work. Don't even consider taking this on champions that can't proc it. It's really bad on long range poke champions that hit you with only 1 spell because they'll never chain together 3 spells to proc Electrocute. Xerath, for instance, would suck with this rune. It's relatively balanced early and late game despite the way that it might look, starting with 70 base damage. Most mages simply don't want this. It's better on assassins. Some mages, like Kassadin or Vladimir, choose to play as assassins. They'll itemize into pen or burst over CDR, and that synergizes well with Electrocute. But if those champions chose to itemize more like mages, for instance, Vladimir has metas where he might go more CDR, weaving together spells for more healing and more time inside of combat, he wouldn't want to go Electrocute because he would want a rune with a shorter cooldown that he can use more for those longer fights. It's strong on threshold champions as well. We talked about previously those threshold champions such as Jhin needing to kill someone in 1 combo, and having the highest damage rune that will help you kill someone quickly is really effective. Those champions are low CDR, they're high burst, and they're boom or bust, but notably a champion like Jhin, which we're using as an example as a threshold champion, can't actually proc the rune because he can't use 3 abilities really within 3 seconds, so he wouldn't want Electrocute. He might consider another rune. So it's important to consider these factors, and most mages also won't be building this rune unless you are a high burst character who does all of your damage in 1 combo and then gets out of combat. Following Electrocute, we have Dark Harvest, which I'm going to argue is the worst version of Electrocute, though they are slightly different in a very important way. Dark Harvest does damage when a champion below 15% health takes damage from you. You harvest their soul, increasing your Dark Harvest damage by currently 11. It has no scaling base damage. It does 30 damage plus 11 damage per soul, meaning if you don't get souls, your Dark Harvest damage will stay at 30 plus the additional bonus AD and AP that you get as well. Its cooldown is 35 seconds, the longest of the runes, and it resets to 1 second on takedown. Theoretically, this rune can scale better than every other rune if you have a high soul count, but in most cases, if you fall behind, this rune is relatively worthless. As I said, that base damage at 30 is really, really low, and so if you don't get souls, this rune is going to be very, very bad. Now, Dark Harvest is the lowest win rate rune that we're going to go over. It is still excellent on champions that hit low HP targets. Of course, if you're hitting champions that are below 50% HP very easily, then you can proc this rune very easily, getting very good value out of it. It's actually on champions that can chain kills and utilize its reset mechanic, and typically those reset champions fit both these descriptions. They're extremely effective at hitting low HP enemies and then resetting. Think Katarina or Viego. It's also better in low elo matches because low elo matches go longer and have higher kill counts, allowing you to scale with more souls and get more base damage on the rune. Longer game times also help and happen in low elo, so consider this to be a more scaling rune, and if you know that a game is going to go long, Dark Harvest gains value. The rune is literally terrible on most traditional mages. Even a champion like Xerath, which can ult and kill low HP targets, doesn't like building it because the win rate is so damn low, and a rune like Arcane Comet can simply do more damage even if you have high soul counts. It's probably the worst rune in the game with that said, and so consider building this only on the select few reset champions that really fit the bill. The best example, as I said previously, of a reset champion who hits low HP targets is of course Katarina. Katarina players in modern day run Electrocute in like 90% of games. You'll see that Katarina has 100,000 games with Electrocute and only 9,000 games with Dark Harvest. But Dark Harvest has an almost 1% higher win rate than Electrocute. Now there's reasons why this could be happening outside of Dark Harvest being better, but I'm using it as one example to showcase that this does match up. What I'm saying does work. And if you were to look at champions and look at their their runes and the runes that they would be building versus the runes that people are actually building on them, you'll find a mismatch a lot of the time. Katarina is a reset champion that hits low HP targets, and players not building Dark Harvest on her is frankly insane. I understand that Electrocute is better inside of trades, and it allows Katarina to get more damage on her lane opponent that is above 50% HP, but Dark Harvest is what Katarina is trying to do: kill low HP targets and then get resets. So I can't fully understand why the communities behind some champions haven't really done the research into what runes are good. So take this with a grain of salt, and just note that looking at the highest play rate runes for your champion is not going to give you the guaranteed results. And our final rune is First Strike. First Strike is the most unique rune on this page. Attacks or abilities against an enemy within 0.25 seconds of entering combat grant you 10 gold and First Strike for 3 seconds. First Strike causes the damage that you deal to be 7% increased, and granting 50% of that damage as gold, or 35% if you're ranged. First thing, whoa, look at that win rate, okay? 50.68% win rate before you've even loaded into the game. That's incredibly high. Now, of course, you need to strike first in order to proc First Strike, so it requires you to be the first person to enter combat. It has a reasonably large cooldown. It only lasts for 3 seconds after you proc it. It gives you both gold and damage, so it does less damage than the other runes in the trade-off of giving you gold, and it gives you an additional 15% gold if you are melee rather than ranged. I said additional because I feel like it gives you plenty if you're ranged. It's just kind of a bonus if you're melee. Note that because you need to be able to strike first, it is terrible on short-range champions that can't surprise the enemy to get the first hit. It's really strong on burst champions though, because there's only 3 seconds of bonus, so you need to combo really quickly to get advantage out of it. Those burst champions that can use all their spells in that window, really good, can take full advantage of the damage and gold increase. Burst champions tend to also just be high damage, which lets you get a lot of value out of the gold portion of the rune. It is the strongest rune in the game by win rate, though it's incredibly feast or famine. If you don't proc it, you get nothing. Unlike every other rune, which doesn't simply have a lose condition, Arcane Comet doesn't just go off cooldown if you miss a spell, you just have to hit the next one. First Strike has a lose condition. If you get hit first, you get no value out of the rune, so keep that in mind. It's really good on champions that want gold, not utility or support champions that function with low economy. Typically, those champions that want gold also have high AD and AP ratios and spike at 3rd or 4th item because of this. First Strike, of course, allows you to get more gold, getting to that 3rd and 4th item faster, and so it's an incredibly good choice for those types of champions. So with that said, there is the fact that First Strike is completely broken. It's probably the strongest rune at the moment, and if you're a champion that can strike from far away, Xerath, Syndra, even champions that can open from stealth, such as Twitch, they can take pretty strong advantage of this rune, getting a lot of gold. But it does have the lose condition of being struck first, and so if you can't take consistent advantage of First Strike's gold and burst value, then you don't want to go this rune at all, because you won't be getting anything from it, and so it's incredibly boom or bust. Now that we've gone over all the keystones, let's go over the secondary rune options. Starting with the Precision Tree, let's walk through every single row of the page. The first options we have are Absorb Life, Triumph, and Presence of Mind, with Presence of Mind being the clear winner in this page for mages, although if you don't need extra mana, you can go Triumph. In the second row, we have Alacrity, Legend Haste, and Legend Bloodline, and for the reason that mages don't care about attack speed or lifesteal, you can just run Legend Haste. And in the third row, we have Coup de Grace, Cut Down, and Last Stand. Note that Cut Down is significantly stronger than Coup de Grace and Last Stand, doing about 900 damage on average more per game than the other 2 runes. So for this reason, we'll take Cut Down every single game. If it was a bit closer, we could have a conversation about when it's doing more damage and if the more damage is actually useful, but because it's so much stronger at the moment than the other 2 runes, Cut Down is the clear winner. Next, we have the Domination Tree. On the first row, we have Cheap Shot, Taste of Blood, and Sudden Impact. Sudden Impact is the clear winner if your champion has a dash, as this rune can often be as strong as a keystone by itself. If you don't have a dash, however, you would then use Cheap Shot, especially if your champion, such as Lux, has a slow or immobilizing effect. And if you don't have the other 2, well, then you can simply run Taste of Blood, though it is the worst of the 3 runes in this row. Afterwards, moving on to that next section, these 3 runes absolutely suck, and it's the main reason why Domination is considered the worst tree in the entire game. It's also a really strong deterrent for champions running Electrocute or Dark Harvest. Unless those runes are literally perfect on your champion, this singular row is so valueless that it makes the Domination Tree suck. I recommend going the rune all the way on the left-hand side, Sixth Sense, just because it has the highest win rate, but honestly, I really don't care about this row. I think all of these runes are useless, and I try to avoid going Domination at all costs. And then finally, on the bottom row, we have Treasure Hunter, Ultimate Hunter, and Relentless Hunter. Relentless Hunter is really good on a select few champions that really care about mobility and roaming out of combat. Most mages, however, will take Treasure Hunter or Ultimate Hunter. Ultimate Hunter is really good if you're reliant on your ultimate in order to get kills. Otherwise, just go Treasure Hunter for some extra gold. But honestly, very few champions should find themselves inside of this Domination page, as it really does suck. Third, we have the Sorcery Tree. Starting at the top row, we have Axiom Arcanist, Mana Flow Band, and Nimbus Cloak. Nimbus Cloak will be the seldom used of the three for mages. Go Mana Flow Band, as most mages will need mana. However, if your champion really doesn't, then you can go Axiom Arcanist, as this is your second best option. Nimbus Cloak got nerfed a lot a while back, and really the movement speed isn't super effective for mages. On the second row, we have Transcendence, Celerity, and Absolute Focus. Transcendence is by far the clear winner here on every single mage, and I mean this sincerely. The only champion that I'll really run Absolute Focus on are champions that care zero about CDR. Sometimes I'll run it on Xerath, for instance, because he does damage from really far away and he tries to one-shot you from off your screen, but 95% of mages will be running Transcendence. That's because 10 ability haste is worth way more than 18 ability power. It's a math equation. You can tell the gold efficiency of Transcendence and Absolute Focus, and Transcendence gives you more gold value while also not giving you conditional stats, as Absolute Focus will only apply above 70% HP. Moving on from that, we have Scorch, Water Walking, and Gathering Storm. With Gathering Storm being the strongest in this row, Water Walking is a never build on mages, and Scorch is good, but only if you're in extremely aggressive lanes where you can proc this often. I'll often take it inside of mid lane, but not inside of bot lane. That's because mages get outscaled in bot lane, and Gathering Storm helps to offset some of the outscaling that ADCs have over mages, making that weakness a little less bad later on in the game. However, the two runes are really close in strength here, and most players do prefer running Scorch. It has almost 3 times the game count of Gathering Storm, so I'll let you make your own decision here. It's really not too big of a difference. Next, we have the Resolve Tree. On the first row, we have Demolish, Font of Life, and Shield Bash. Demolish is not a good rune on mages. Skip it and ignore it. Font of Life is an excellent rune, but only if your champion can actually proc it. I'd recommend building this on a lot of enchanters, such as Karma, but most champions sadly won't be able to use this, and so if you can't use it, then just take Shield Bash or some of the other runes in this page instead. But honestly though, you shouldn't be running any of the 3 runes at the top of the page, instead focusing on the other 2 rows, and no mage in the game will ever go Resolve for their keystone, so you'll never be forced to make 3 decisions inside of this tree. For our next row, we have Conditioning, Second Wind, and Bone Plating, with Second Wind being the best early game option and Bone Plating being the best late game option. Conditioning is really bad though. I would never recommend running this on a mage. It does better if you have bonus armor and magic resist, and notably we don't build those stats very often. So I go Bone Plating in almost every single game, and the only time that I'll take Resolve secondary is when I'm against an extremely all-in heavy champion, such as Fizz or Nefiri, and Bone Plating can help protect me in the case that the enemy does get on top of me. Then that final row, always take Overgrowth. You can take Unflinching against champions that have a lot of CC, but honestly, the rune is really weak, so I would always take Overgrowth. Otherwise, you can take Revitalize if your champion has some enchanter mechanics, though that rune is also fairly underpowered as well. So I'd recommend going Overgrowth in almost every situation if you do find yourself going Resolve secondary. And finally, we have the Inspiration Tree, with Hex Flash, Magical Footwear, and Cashback on our first row. Cashback is the clear winner of the 3. Magical Footwear does gain value in higher elo, as mobility is a stat that better players tend to use more effectively, so if you're below Masters, I'd say running Cashback every single game will be more effective. It does have a 50% higher win rate than free boots, and so Cashback is, of course, just the best option. On the next row, we have Triple Tonic, Time Warp Tonic, and Biscuit Delivery. Time Warp Tonic is unironically the worst rune in the entire game. Do not build this. Biscuit Delivery also sucks. Always go Triple Tonic. That will be the best rune by far in this row. And finally, on the third row, we have Cosmic Insight, Approach Velocity, and Jack of All Trades. Jack of All Trades is the strongest in this page by far, but if your champion does not build many unique stats, say less than 5 unique stats, then you can go Cosmic Insight, which once again does perform better at higher elo, because higher elo players make better use of their summoner spells instead of relying on base stats. Alright, so we just went through every single rune in their respective rows, one by one, to tell you which would be the best. But now we need to talk about those pages holistically. What page should you be running? Well, most mages will be running Sorcery, Domination, or Inspiration as their primary page, with an emphasis on mages running Sorcery. So you're left with the other 4 pages as a decision that you might be taking for your secondary page. Let's rank them all in order. Domination is by far the worst secondary page that you can ever run. I run this on exactly 0 mages that I play. If you can run Sudden Impact, maybe you can make good use of this page. However, I personally never run it. The next worst page we have is the Resolve Tree. This tree is viable against assassins, where you can take Bone Plating Overgrowth for some added tankiness. I, however, never build this page as well, opting in for other ways to stay tanky, such as itemizing differently or taking Exhaust. I really don't think you should be changing your rune page just to avoid getting one-shot by one champion on the enemy team. Instead, I prefer to use my runes for something that I deem to be more important, such as having more resources, more stats later on in the game, or increased income from Inspiration. Next, we have the third worst tree, and this was a tough one, and I'm gonna leave that at Sorcery. The reason why is not because Sorcery is bad, it's because the other pages are really really good. If you are running sorcery as your secondary, I recommend running Mana Flow Band always, always, always if you need mana, and then beyond that, running Transcendence as your second rune on the page. If you don't need mana, you can run Transcendence Gathering Storm, and that will be your second best option. For our second best page, we have the Inspiration Tree. When I run this tree secondary, I almost always go Cashback Jack of all trades, but as I said, if your champion cannot take advantage of the unique stats bonus of Jack of all trades, you can go Triple Tonic instead. So your runes, instead of going Jack of all trades, would be Cashback Triple Tonic. This is an especially good page, especially for those that don't need the ability haste from our clear winner, Precision, and also for those who don't need the mana sustain that Sorcery provides. Even though I think it's the second best page, I actually think it's not the second most utilized secondary page. The reason for this is if you need mana, you'll usually go Sorcery, and if you need damage, you'll usually go Precision. And that leaves very, very few champions running Inspiration as their secondary tree, because those needs are covered by those other two pages, even though I really do think it's a solid tree, and if Precision does get nerfed, we might find ourselves going back to running Inspiration secondary. And our clear winner is Inspiration as our secondary tree, with an emphasis on Presence of Mind if you really need mana sustain. Otherwise, you can just go Legend Haste, Cut Down. Legend Haste giving you 15 ability haste is extremely overtuned, and Cut Down is what I would consider the strongest secondary rune in the entire game. And finally, we have the stat shards. Now, I want to point out something extremely interesting about the stat shards, and that's that the underutilized stat shards in every single row also have the highest win rate. For example, in the top row, Ability Haste has almost a tenth of the game's attack speed, but it has a 0.7% higher win rate. In the second row, Move Speed is the least taken and also has the highest win rate by almost 0.5%. And finally, Tenacity has the highest win rate in the third row as well. With that said, I recommend taking Ability Haste almost every single game in your first row. In the second row, taking movement speed if you're a champion that takes good advantage of weaving in and out of fights, such as a battle mage like Rise or Cassiopeia. Otherwise, take Adaptive Force. And then finally, I usually take flat health or tenacity, depending on the enemy team comp, though for most mages, you'll be going flat health, because if you're CC'd, you're dead anyways. It doesn't matter if the CC lasts 2 seconds or 1.5 seconds. No matter what, if someone touches you, you're dead on most mages. So flat health tends to be the best option, as it gets you through the lane and has a 0.7% higher win rate than scaling health, which, though it does have its use case, in lanes where you're just scaling, not interacting, and trying to get through that laning phase, flat health tends to be the best option. Thank you guys for watching. I really hope you guys enjoyed. This was my rune guide. I spent a lot of time on this, trying to put something together that could be a staple for you guys to understand how runes work for mages. I also learned a lot myself as I went through the steps of trying to get the stats for all the different runes. It's not something that someone who plays a lot of League ever really does. It's just sit down and to look at what's good and actually just read everything from start to finish. So this was an experience, hopefully for the both of us. I appreciate you guys, and if you want more videos like this, please leave it in the description down below. I've been evandabank, and have a great rest of your day.